The first thing Clara Vance noticed about the three riders was not their guns. It was the road beneath them. The wheel ruts had been cut too deep for a supply wagon and too evenly for a cattle cart. The iron rims had pressed almost 2 inches into ground, baked hard by an Arizona summer. Whatever had passed through the narrow mountain passage had been heavy, repeated, and recent. Clara drew her pony to a stop where the red walls pinched the trail into a corridor. Heat trembled over the stones. Creosote gave off its bitter, dusty smell, and somewhere above, a hawk cried once before the canyon swallowed the sound. The riders blocked the only open path. The man in the center wore a dark coat, despite the heat. His boots were polished, his saddle expensive, his face narrow and clean-shaven. Clara had seen men like him in railway offices and county rooms, men who never lifted what they owned, only pointed at it on paper. "Miss Vance," he said, "you have made better time than expected." She did not ask how he knew her name. The rider to his right leaned forward and spat tobacco juice beside Cinder's front hoof. He was broad through the chest, with a flattened nose and one ear thickened from old fights. "This her?" he asked. The well-dressed man nodded. "Clara Vance, this is Silas Grissom. My name is Preston Thorne. I represent the Western Range and Water Company." "Syndicate," Clara said. Thorne's mouth changed by less than a smile. People use that word when they dislike organization. Grissom looked her over slowly. Clara was accustomed to that pause. At 24, she had the face of a younger woman and the height of a child who had stopped growing early. Men noticed the small boots, the narrow shoulders, the short reach. They rarely noticed the rope scars crossing her palms or the weight distribution of the tools tied behind her saddle. Grissom laughed. "That ranch sent for this?" Clara slid down from Cinder. Her skirt was split for riding and stained white at the hem from alkali dust. Without speaking, she crouched beside the nearest rut and placed 2 fingers against its wall. The edge was sharp. The wagon had passed within the last day. "What are you doing?" Thorne asked. She measured the distance between the paired grooves with the heel of her boot. Standard freight axle. The horse tracks beside them were deep at the toe, meaning the team had pulled uphill under load. On the right side of the trail, a fist-sized chip of black paint clung to a rock, iron-bound crates. Grissom swung one leg over his saddle horn. "Girl, when a man speaks to you." "The wagons carried more than fence wire," Clara said. Thorne's eyes sharpened. She stood and brushed dust from her knee. "And you sent at least 4, maybe 5. The last one dragged a brake shoe on the right rear wheel. For the first time, Grissom stopped smiling. Thorne studied her with more care. "You have been hired to perform repairs at Ironstock Ranch. Nothing there concerns the company except an unsettled title dispute. Then why are your wagons measuring the passage?" "Turn around," he said. "The ranch is not safe. Nishi Ironstock is an old man with old habits and a talent for making enemies. You will find work in Santa Pilar. I can arrange it." The offer carried the flat tone of a closed door. Clara had heard it from shop owners who placed a broom in her hands and took it away before she could finish sweeping. She had heard it from her father when he told neighbors she was too small to harness a mule and too stubborn to make a useful wife. She looked past the riders toward the distant bend where the passage climbed. Grissom rested one hand on his holster. "You deaf? No, then get back on that pony." Clara mounted. Cinder was a short, gray mountain mare with a dark stripe down her back, unimpressive beside the Syndicate's long-legged horses. Clara gathered the reins and turned not toward the open desert, but toward a narrow shelf of shale climbing the canyon's western face. Thorne's voice hardened. "That trail is not passable. It is for us." She touched her heels to Cinder's sides. Behind her, Grissom cursed. Hooves struck stone. 2 riders came after her, while Thorne shouted for them not to break their horses. Clara leaned low over Cinder's neck. The mare's mane smelled of dust and sweat. Ahead, the path narrowed to a pale seam above a drop filled with broken red rock. A heavy horse would punch through the loose surface. Cinder placed her feet carefully, testing each stone before committing her weight. 1, 2, 3, Clara whispered. "Breathe. 1, 2, 3. The first pursuer gained on the lower slope. His horse was faster and nearly twice Cinder's size. Clara guided the mare toward a fan of gray scree where larger stones formed a thin line along the outer edge. Cinder stepped onto it. The mountain shifted under them with the sound of dry grain pouring from a sack. Clara kept her weight centered. The mare's small hooves found the anchored rocks one by one. Behind them came a shout, then the violent scrape of iron shoes. One of the larger horses slid sideways. Its rider hauled on the reins, cursing as loose shale spilled toward the ravine. The second man tried to pass and nearly struck him. Both were forced to turn back. Clara did not look down until she reached the ridge. From there the men appeared small enough to fit beneath her thumb. Grissom stood in the passage with his hat in one hand, his anger visible even at that distance. Thorne remained mounted and still. He was no longer watching her as a nuisance. He was watching her as a problem. The basin opened beyond the ridge, hidden from the desert by a broken ring of mountains. Green cottonwoods followed a silver thread of water across the valley floor. Cattle moved like dark seeds through high grass. At the northern wall stood a ranch house built of basalt and cedar, broad and low, its stonework rising from the earth as if the mountain had shaped rooms for human use. Clara had expected isolation. She had not expected order. Terraces held back soil along the slope. Ditches crossed the pasture at precise grades. Windbreaks of cedar and mesquite protected the corrals. At the entrance to the inner ranch stood two gates taller than any barn door she had seen, each made from whole cedar trunks bound with iron and rawhide. Cinder picked her way down the hidden trail. By the time Clara entered the yard, the sun had shifted west and the basalt walls held long strips of shadow. A hammer stopped ringing at the forge. Two ranch hands leaned against a corral rail and stared. One was young and narrow-faced. The other had a red beard gone mostly gray. The young man called toward the porch, "Someone lose a schoolgirl?" His companion laughed. Clara dismounted and untied the canvas roll from behind her saddle. The tools inside knocked together: a short spade, two chisels, a mallet, a narrow pry bar, a coil of waxed line, files, and a folding rule with brass joints. A shape separated itself from the porch shadow. Nishi Ironstock was not old in the way Thorne had suggested. He might have been 45 or 50, though the sun had marked his face deeply. He was simply enormous. His shoulders nearly filled the doorway. His dark hair, threaded with silver, had been tied at the nape of his neck. A scar ran from the corner of his jaw into the collar of his work shirt. He walked into the yard without hurry. Clara had met big men who made a performance of their size. Nishi did not. He moved carefully, as if strength was a tool that could be damaged through careless use. "You are Clara Vance," he said. "Yes. You came by the west shelf. The passage was occupied by Thorne and Grissom." The young ranch hand at the rail said, "She rode that shelf?" Nishi ignored him. His eyes moved from Clara's face to the tool roll, then to Cinder's legs. He crouched, ran one hand down the mare's left foreleg, and found a shallow scrape above the fetlock. "You pushed her hard." I asked her carefully. Nye looked up. Something in his expression shifted. He stood and held out his hand, palm upward. Clara assumed he meant to shake. When she reached for him, he turned her hand over. His thumb rested beside the thick rope scar below her fingers. He examined the split callus at the base of her thumb, the old puncture near her wrist, and the faint white line left by a trace chain. The laughter at the corral stopped. "How did this happen?" he asked, touching the trace chain scar. "A freight team panicked in a wash. The driver jumped. I did not. And this? Rope burn. A mule went through river ice. You saved it? I saved the harness." The mule saved itself. The corner of his mouth moved, almost invisible. He released her hand and lifted the short spade from her tool roll. The blade had been filed narrow and sharp. He balanced it across one finger. Why cut the handle? It fits where a full spade will not. The red-bearded hand pushed away from the corral. "Boss, she can't lift a hay bale." Nishi turned his head. "A capstone is smaller than a foundation stone," he said. "Remove enough capstones and the foundation falls. Place them correctly and it holds." The man lowered his eyes. Nishi handed the spade back to Clara. "Eat first. Work after. Am I hired?" He glanced at her palms again. "You arrived with tools." It was the nearest thing to yes she needed. The kitchen was cool and dim. Sunlight entered through a high window and lay across the floor in a gold rectangle. A pot of beans simmered on the stove beside a flat iron pan. The room smelled of toasted corn, smoke, and dried chile. Nishi set a plate in front of her. He did not ask why she had come alone, where her family lived, or whether she could endure ranch work. He poured water into a tin cup and sat across from her at the scarred oak table. Clara ate until the shaking in her arms stopped. Afterward, he took a dry twig and drew a map in spilled flour near the edge of the table. The basin's water came from snowmelt stored in fractures high in the northern ridge. Generations before, Nishi's mother's family had begun lining natural channels with stacked stone, cedar braces, and covered vents to reduce evaporation. His father had extended the system after acquiring the ranch title. The result was a network of tunnels and pressure chambers running beneath the basin. "The Acequias," Clara said. He nodded. "Not the open ditches, you know. The outer channels are simple, the old veins are not." He marked a branch no wider than his finger. "Summer silt gathers here, roots enter here. When air stops moving, the stone sweats and the cedar rots. My shoulders do not pass the second bend." Clara studied the map. "And no one else can hear the blockage?" Nishi looked at her. "I was told you could." Years earlier, Clara had worked for a canal builder outside Tucson. The engineer's wife had hired her to wash clothes. Clara spent evenings beside the excavation, listening to water move through temporary pipes. When a buried joint cracked, she heard the pitch change before the men saw mud. The engineer dismissed her warning. Half a day later, a trench wall collapsed and killed 2 mules. After that, he let her carry tools. Nishi swept the flour flat with his hand. "Come," he led her past the cedar gates and along the cliff base to a panel hidden behind brush. When he pulled it aside, cold air breathed from the rock. The tunnel entrance was shoulder-wide for Clara and barely hip-wide for him. Inside, lantern light revealed fitted stone darkened by moisture. Cedar braces crossed overhead. Water moved somewhere behind the walls with a low, continuous hum. Nishi went first until the passage narrowed. His shoulders scraped both sides. He stopped at a branch where the ceiling dropped. "Listen." Clara knelt. Damp grit soaked through her skirt. She placed her palm against the stone. At first she heard only water. Then the layers separated. The steady bass of the main flow. The thin tapping of a drip, the whisper of air through a vent. Beneath them was a stuttering vibration, irregular and faint. "Gravel," she said, or a cedar splinter turning in the current, 20 feet in. She tied back her hair, took the small lamp, and crawled. The ceiling descended until it brushed her shoulders. The tunnel smelled of lime, wet wood, and old mineral deposits. At the first bend, she exhaled completely and slid sideways through a joint that would not have admitted a larger person. Beyond it, the sound sharpened. She found a filtration grate clogged by pebbles and a length of rotted root. Pressure had packed silt around an iron lever. Using the narrow spade, she loosened the mud a spoonful at a time. The lever groaned when she worked it free. Water surged through the grate, cold enough to numb her wrist. The stuttering vibration vanished. In its place came a deep, even note. She remained still for several breaths, cheek against stone, feeling the whole system settle. When she crawled out, her clothes were gray with mud, and her hair had come loose. Nishi waited beside the intake pool. The surface, cloudy when they entered, had cleared enough to reflect the evening sky. He handed her a cloth and a water skin. "That branch has been weak since spring," he said. "The cedar is sound. The grate was set half an inch too low. I set it, then you set it half an inch too low." The ranch hands nearby went still. Nishi looked at the water, then at her. "Tomorrow you will show me." Clara drank. "Tomorrow I will fix it." That night she slept in a narrow room near the kitchen. The mattress smelled of sun-dried cotton and cedar shavings. Through the wall came the low vibration of the water channels and the occasional shift of livestock in the corral. She had spent years sleeping lightly, one hand near her boots, ready to leave before someone decided she had become inconvenient. At Ironstock Ranch, she woke only once. Outside her window, Nishi crossed the courtyard, carrying an iron wrench in one hand and a lantern in the other. He paused at the gates and pressed his palm to the timber as though taking the pulse of a living thing. Clara lay back down. For the first time in months, she did not dream of roads. 3 days later, Preston Thorne arrived with an envelope. He brought 6 riders and stopped outside the cedar gates. Dust hung around the horses' legs. Grissom sat to his right, a healing scrape across his cheek from the mountain trail. Nishi stood in the passage without a weapon. Clara waited several steps behind him. She had spent the morning replacing cedar pegs in the east vent and still carried a smear of black silt along one forearm. Thorne held out the envelope. "This is a formal notice of claim," he said. "The company purchased upstream rights from the Marston estate. Your irrigation works divert water belonging to our lease." Nishi did not take the paper. The wind moved between them, hot and dry. Thorne extended his arm farther. "Refusal to accept service does not invalidate it." Nishi looked over his shoulder at Clara. The gesture was slight, but every rider saw it. Clara stepped forward and took the envelope. Thorne had to lower his hand to place it in hers. She opened it carefully. The seal bore the company's mark, but the survey description listed a boundary stone she knew had washed away in the flood of 1884. The claim relied on an old channel map drawn before the covered Acequias had been completed. This document describes a dry creek west of the ridge, she said. It describes the lawful watershed. It describes land that does not feed this basin. Thorne's jaw tightened. Are you an attorney now? No, I can read a grade line. Grissom snorted. Can you read what happens when men stop asking polite? Nishi's gaze moved to him. Grissom's hand left his holster. Thorne gathered his reins. You have 10 days. After that, the company will secure its property. He turned his horse. Before riding away, he looked at Clara. You are standing between powers you do not understand. She folded the notice and slipped it into her belt. I understand weight, she said. Your wagons told me enough. The riders left in a cloud of dust. Nishi waited until the sound faded. 10 days. Clara said less. They expect the paper to frighten us. No. The paper is for anyone who asks later why they came armed. He led her to the gates. The western post had shifted a fraction where cedar met basalt. Chase threaded a wet rawhide strap through the outer gap, but his fingers could not reach the internal peg. The stones scraped his knuckles. Clara removed her coat and pushed one arm into the 4-inch space. The wood was warm on one side, cold stone on the other. Her fingertips found the peg. She caught the rawhide, pulled it through, and began the figure 8 binding Nishi had shown her. Not that turn, he said. It lies flatter. It will slip when it dries. She loosened it and followed his method. He held the post steady while she worked inside the joint. The rawhide squeaked against cedar. By sunset, they had bound all 4 anchor points. As the straps dried, they tightened until the gates felt less like joined pieces than a single structure. At supper, Nishi drew another map in the dust on the table. Thorne looks for the neck, he said, marking the narrow mountain passage. If he cannot take the gates, he will strike the water. Clara traced the hidden channels with one finger. The eastern line is closest to the boundary, and easiest to damage, but also easiest to hear. Nishi placed the twig down, then listened before he speaks. The following afternoon, Clara saw a flash on the northern ridge. She was crouched beneath a salt cedar, examining the soil around an overflow vent. The light appeared once, vanished, and returned in a thin white needle. Telescope glass. She recognized the man behind it. Josiah Blackwood had ridden with Thorne on the first day, quiet and uneasy in the saddle. He was a surveyor, by his clothes and posture, the kind who watched ground more than people. Clara reached into the pocket of her trousers and found a green shard from a broken bottle. Tilting it toward the sun, she caught the light and sent it back. The flare struck the ridge. Blackwood jerked away from the telescope. In the second he was blinded, Clara moved sideways through brush too low and tangled for a grown man. She crossed a dry wash, doubled back beneath an overhang, and climbed to a shelf behind him. From there she watched him recover and searched the empty ground where she had been. He wrote something in a notebook. Clara marked the direction of his horse, the length of his stay, and the angle of his glass. He was not studying the gates. He was studying the vents. That evening she found Nish repairing a plowshare at the forge. Sparks rose around his arms. Blackwood mapped the east line, she said. Nishi set the hammer down. Did he see you? He saw light. When? Midday. Nishi looked toward the darkening ridge. They will move before dawn. They carried tools to the eastern intake and worked by lantern. Clara checked the stone seams while Nish lifted replacement slabs from a cart. The night smelled of cold iron and sage. Coyotes called beyond the basin wall. Near midnight, Clara pressed her palm to the basalt and felt a clean, steady flow. Nothing yet, she said. Nishi sat against the cliff, arms resting on his knees. Sleep. You first. He did not answer. They both remained awake. The strike came at noon instead. Clara was kneeling beside the eastern vent when the water's note changed. The low hum rose into a thin whistle, followed by a hollow rattle, a breach. She ran without calling for help. The brush along the boundary was dense enough to hide her. Through the branches she saw Grissom and 2 men with pry bars. They had removed a capstone and were hammering at the cedar brace beneath it. Water seeped through the widening seam, darkening the dust. Grissom wiped his face, hit it lower. Once the foundation washes, the whole line goes. One man swung the sledge again. The blow vibrated through the ground. Clara backed away and took the inner access path. She reached the damaged branch from below, crawling into cold water while the strikes continued inches beyond the stone. A section of cedar had split. Pressure drove gravel through the gap. She wedged a slab of basalt against the break, but the current shoved it sideways. Her tool belt had snagged behind the second bend. She needed a tie. The only cord on her body was the blue ribbon holding back her hair. It had belonged to her mother, who had worn it around a bundle of letters. Clara had kept it through 3 jobs, 2 winters, and every road that followed her father's death. It was faded and frayed, the last soft thing she still carried. She pulled it free. Her hair fell across her face. With numb fingers, she wrapped the ribbon through the iron brace and around the basalt wedge. Once, twice, again. She twisted a cedar chip beneath the knot until the silk tightened like wire. The stone held. She packed wet mortar around the edges and drove 2 wedges home with the heel of her hand. The whistle softened. Above, Grissom cursed. "What happened?" one man asked. Pressure shifted. "Keep hitting it." Clara braced her back against the wall and turned the bypass lever. A burst of cold water shot through the upper crack and struck the men outside. Their shouts came muffled through the stone. One pry bar clanged away. Boots scrambled in mud. By the time Nishi arrived at the boundary road, the saboteurs were retreating toward Thorne's riders. He stood in the center of the track, broad enough to make the path seem narrow. Thorne halted his horse 10 yards away. "You are interfering with a lawful inspection," Thorne called. Nishi's shirt was dark with sweat. He held no rifle. Only the heavy wrench he had been carrying when Clara's signal reached him. "Your men broke the line," he said. "They examined a disputed channel. Then your examination is finished." Thorne looked past him toward the water, spilling harmlessly from the overflow ditch. For a moment his face revealed the calculation beneath his calm. The sabotage should have drained the eastern pasture within hours. Instead, the flow was already stabilizing. His gaze moved to the access opening. Clara crawled out covered in gray mud, her loose hair wet against her shoulders. Blood ran from 2 scraped knuckles. She stood beside Nishi without speaking. Grissom's mouth twisted. Should have buried the little rat in there. Nishi took 1 step forward. The wrench remained at his side, but Grissom's horse backed away. Thorne raised a hand. "Enough, we are leaving." He turned his horse, not in defeat, but in thought. Clara watched until the riders disappeared. Nishi looked at her hair, then at the repaired waterline. "The ribbon? In the wall." He nodded once. Nothing more was said. Yet when they returned to the ranch, Clara found a small cedar box outside her room. Inside lay a length of blue cloth, darker and stronger than the ribbon she had sacrificed. She carried it to the kitchen, where Nishi was sharpening a draw knife. "You did not have to replace it." "I did not." "That is for tying tools," he said. "It looks like ribbon." "It is cloth." Clara waited. Nishi continued sharpening the blade, though the edge had already become bright. She tied the cloth around her hair. The next threat came in a sweeter smell. Near the northern grain bins, Clara found oats scattered in a neat pile beside the fence. Molasses coated the husks. No animal had touched them. She crouched without using her hands and leaned close. Bitter almond lay beneath the sugar. Nishi approached from the corral. "What is it?" "Poison." He squatted beside her. "Strychnine?" "I think so." They followed the scattered grains to a boot print near the wall. The heel carried a triangular cut, matching the tracks Blackwood had left at the east vent. Clara looked toward the ridge. He came inside. Nishi's face became still. They burned the poisoned grain in an iron pan and moved the cattle to the southern field. Then Nishi went alone to the western perimeter after dark. Josiah Blackwood arrived shortly after midnight. He crossed the outer wall where stacked basalt formed a low shoulder beneath the cedar gates. He moved cautiously, pausing at every owl call and shifting branch. In one hand he carried a packet wrapped in oilcloth. In the other, a short knife he never drew. Nishi watched from the shadow of a buttress. Blackwood ran his fingers along the wall, testing mortar joints. He stopped near a drainage plug disguised as a foundation stone. Nishi stepped out. Blackwood spun and struck the wall with his back. The knife fell into the dust. Neither man spoke. Nishi could have seized him. Instead, he placed one hand on the decoy stone and shifted it enough to reveal darkness behind it. Blackwood stared at the opening. Nishi stepped away. The surveyor's fear competed with greed. He knelt, touched the loose mortar, and looked toward the silent giant. When Nishi did not move, Blackwood gathered his knife and fled. At dawn, Nishi showed Clara the disturbed dust. "You let him see this?" she asked. "He came for a weakness. So you gave him one. A door that leads nowhere." Clara examined the drainage chamber beyond the plug. It descended toward an overflow cistern separated from the courtyard by a sealed stone wall. A man entering during high flow would find himself in a cold rising box. She looked at the upper sluice map in her mind. If we clear the north branch, we can flood the chamber in less than a minute. Without drowning him? If he runs when the water reaches his knees, Nichi's eyes rested on her. And if he does not, then we open the lower release. They spent the morning clearing the overflow channel. Nish lifted the capstones. Clara crawled beneath them and removed roots packed around the gate. Their work had become a rhythm, his strength opening the structure, her precision correcting what lay inside. By noon, the trap was ready. That night, however, the Syndicate did not use Blackwood's false door. Grissom came through the passage with 8 riders. Clara lay in a crevice above the trail, one hand on a cedar lever connected to a support frame buried beneath a slope of loose rock. For 3 days she had studied the slide, where the largest stones rested, how far the debris would travel, and which portion could be released without crushing horses or men. Below, moonlight silvered the riders' hats. Grissom rode first. "Straight to the gates," he said. "No stopping this time." The men carried rifles and coils of rope. One led a mule loaded with oil cans. Clara waited until Grissom's horse passed a white quartz marker. She pulled the lever. The support gave way with a deep wooden crack. For one breath, nothing happened. Then the mountain sighed. Shale began to slide. Pebbles became stones, stones became boulders, and a gray river poured across the trail. Horses screamed and reared. Riders hauled them backward as dust filled the passage. The controlled fall buried the route ahead beneath 6 feet of rock, while leaving the animals room to retreat. Grissom shouted into the darkness, "Show yourselves." An arrow struck the ground beside his horse. A second landed behind the group. A third buried itself between the oil mule's front hooves. High on the opposite ridge, Nishi stood with a bow. He drew and released with slow precision, marking a semicircle around the trapped riders. The men fired blindly. Muzzle flashes lit only dust and stone. Nishi's final arrow shattered the lantern hanging from Grissom's saddle. Darkness closed over them. The retreat began with one frightened horse, then another. Soon the whole group scrambled back toward the desert, cursing and colliding in the narrow trail. Clara remained in the crevice until the hoofbeats faded. When she climbed down, Nich was already crossing the fresh rock fall. He carried the bow in one hand. "They will bring powder now," she said. "Yes. They cannot clear this before morning. They will not need the road clear if they mean to remove the road." They stood together in the moonlit dust. The new wall of stone looked ancient, as though the mountain had always intended it to be there. Clara sat on a boulder and flexed her aching fingers. Nishi lowered himself beside her. For a while they listened to gravel settle. "My father used to say stubbornness was the only thing about me that grew properly," Clara said. Nishi looked toward the passage. Was he right? Yes. Then he noticed one useful thing. She laughed before she could stop herself. The sound seemed out of place after gunfire, small and bright against the canyon walls. Nichi's face remained solemn, but his eyes warmed. By sunrise, Preston Thorne had ordered the powder wagons brought from the railhead. He stood at the edge of his camp, kicking loose shale from the toe of his polished boot. The board in New York had given him 30 days to secure the basin water. He had promised 20. Every delay threatened more than profit. It threatened the position he had built by appearing incapable of failure. Grissom stood nearby with a bandage around one hand. "Mountain came down where she wanted it," he said. "That wasn't luck." Thorne turned on him. "Do you imagine I require an explanation? I imagine you require more men. What I require is obedience." Grissom's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. Thorne looked toward the ridge. He had spent his life believing progress was a line drawn straight across any obstacle. Railways crossed rivers. Banks replaced barter. Corporations outlived families. Men like Nishi Ironstock belonged in his mind to an age already ending. Yet every straight line he drew into the basin bent around stone, water, and one small woman who refused to behave as something negligible. "Bring the black crates," he said, "and double the guards." At the ranch, Clara felt the wagons before she heard them. She lay flat on the cool flagstones of the main room, cheek against the floor. Beneath her, the Acequias carried vibration as clearly as sound. Iron-rimmed wheels struck the distant trail in slow rhythm. Loaded wagons, more than 3. Nishi stood in the doorway. "Powder," she said. He nodded. They walked to the cedar gates at dusk. Storm clouds gathered far to the south, violet above the desert, though no rain reached the basin. Ozone sharpened the air. Nishi rested one hand on the gate bar. "Cinder is saddled in the back corral." Clara looked at him. "The north trail remains open," he said. "You can reach Santa Pilar before midnight. You want me to leave. I want you alive. And you?" "I was born in this basin. That is not an answer. It is the only one I have. Clara looked through the gap between the gates. Far down the passage, dust rose above the approaching wagons. My father spent years telling me I was too small to carry his name, she said. When he died, my brothers sold the wagon shop and said there was no share for someone who had never done a man's work. The canal company paid me half wages because I could fit where others could not, then dismissed me when I asked for full pay. Nishi listened without interruption. I have left every place that found my usefulness cheaper than my life, she continued. I will not leave the first place that understands the difference. His hand tightened on the cedar. The inner pressure gate is dangerous, he said. So are powder wagons. If the upper line opens too fast, it will crush you against the bend. Then I will open it slowly. Nishi looked down at her for a long time. Then he reached into his belt and placed a small notched stone in her palm. One edge had been shaped to match the release wheel inside the upper sluice. My father made that key, he said. There is no second one. Clara closed her fingers around it. I'll bring it back. You will bring yourself back. She removed her coat, tied the blue cloth firmly around her hair, and entered the Acequia. Behind her, Nishi lowered the cedar panel over the opening. The mountain took her into darkness. The first section was dry enough to crawl on her knees. 10 yards in, cold water covered her hands. Her lamp cast a weak circle across cedar braces dark with age. Outside, the first wagon struck the rockfall. The impact traveled through the ridge as a dull pulse. Clara paused, counted to 3, and moved on. At the vertical shaft, she turned sideways and lowered herself by the iron rungs. The walls narrowed below. Moisture beaded on the stone and ran beneath her collar. The air smelled of moss, rust, and the mineral cold of snowmelt that had not seen daylight in months. The notched key pressed against her palm. At the cedar gates, Nishi waited alone. He had sent the ranch hands to the inner wall with rifles and strict orders not to fire unless the gates were breached. Most were good cattlemen, not soldiers. Fear made poor aim, and poor aim killed horses and neighbors as readily as enemies. The powder convoy emerged from the passage after sunset. Grissom drove the first wagon. 4 horses strained against the traces. Behind him came 2 flatbeds loaded with iron-bound crates, and a 4th wagon carrying a cedar trunk trimmed into a battering ram. Thorne rode beside the convoy beneath a black umbrella held by a young clerk whose face had gone pale. Nish lifted the gate bar from its brackets. Grissom laughed. Finally learned sense? Nishi carried the bar into the passage. It was a whole cedar beam, 12 feet long and thick as a man's waist. He set one end against the ground and held the other across his body. Grissom's smile faded. Drive, Thorne ordered. The lead team lunged forward. The wagon gathered speed over the last stretch of clear road. Iron rims struck rock. Harness chains snapped tight. Grissom stood on the footboard, whip raised. Nishi did not move until the wagon was almost upon him. Then he stepped aside and thrust the cedar beam between the spokes of the left front wheel. The wheel stopped. The wagon did not. Wood exploded. The axle twisted with a scream of metal. The vehicle slewed across the passage, throwing Grissom into the dust and blocking the wagons behind it. One powder crate slid against its restraints with a heavy thud. Men shouted, horses reared in the traces. Nish released the broken beam and backed toward the gates. Thorne drew a pistol. Take him. Riders spread along the passage. Deep inside the ridge, Clara reached the pressure chamber. The ceiling barely cleared her back. The master wheel stood half submerged, crusted with rust. She fitted the notched stone into the central slot and pushed. Nothing happened. The wheel had not been opened fully in years. Mineral deposits sealed its shaft. Clara braced both feet against the wall and leaned backward, using her body as a lever. The stone key slipped. Her knuckles struck iron. She swallowed a cry and reset it. Above her, vibration sharpened into scattered impacts, rifle fire against the gate. "Come on," she whispered. She pulled again, not steadily but in short, measured shocks timed to the tremor of water behind the valve. The seal cracked. The wheel moved a finger's width. A deep groan rolled through the tunnel. Outside, Thorne's men dragged the ruined wagon aside and brought the powder crates forward by hand. Grissom had blood across one cheek and murder in his eyes. "Set them against both posts," he ordered. Enough to turn the whole gate into kindling. 2 men carried the first crate toward the western hinge. Nishi stood behind the gates now, listening to their boots. The ranch hands waited at the inner firing slots. He raised one hand, keeping them still. A small vibration entered the cedar beneath his palm. Clara had opened the upper line. He stepped away from the gate. In the pressure chamber, water hissed through the widening seam. Clara turned the wheel another quarter. The current rose around her calves. The trap required balance. Too little flow and the vents would only spray. Too much and pressure could collapse the old north branch, or kill her before she reached the exit. She placed 2 fingers against the wall. The water's note climbed. When it reached the pitch Nishi had taught her to fear, she stopped. She removed the key and crawled toward the secondary lever. At the gates, Grissom knelt beside the powder crate with a fuse in one hand. Thorne watched from horseback. Make it long enough to clear the passage. Grissom grinned without humor. I only need it long enough for us. He struck a match. The match went out. A thread of water had fallen across his hand. He looked up. From a narrow stone vent above the gate came another drip, then another. What is that? The clerk asked. The mountain answered. Compressed air screamed through the hidden channels. A dozen vents opened at once, releasing white jets that struck the passage walls and burst into freezing mist. Horses shied. Men covered their faces. Grissom tried to relight the fuse. The western outlet released a solid stream of water that hit the powder crate hard enough to roll it away from the post. The lid split. Black grain spilled into mud. Move the other crates! Thorne shouted. The second release came from beneath the road. Stone grates Clara had cleared that morning lifted under hydraulic pressure. Water erupted around the wagons, turning dust into deep slurry within seconds. Wheels sank to their hubs. Men slipped while trying to free the teams. Nishi opened the cedar gates. Through the mist he appeared enormous, framed by stone and water. He carried no firearm. He seized the tongue of the battering ram wagon and pulled it sideways while its wheels floated in the mud. The vehicle turned across the passage, blocking the powder teams from retreating in order. Panic spread faster than the flood. One rider fired. The shot struck the gate above Nishi's shoulder. The ranch hands answered with 2 rounds into the air. The horses broke. Teams backed into one another. Harness snapped. Men abandoned the crates and scrambled toward higher ground as water rose around their boots. Thorne's stallion lost footing and went to one knee. Thorne threw himself clear, landing in the mud with his coat beneath him. The black umbrella drifted past like a dead bird. Grissom grabbed the clerk by the collar. Get that fuse lit. The powder is soaked. Then open a fresh crate. A surge struck them at the knees. The clerk tore free and ran. Inside the mountain, Clara felt the pressure change. The wheel behind her began turning on its own. The upper valve had slipped. Water slammed into the chamber, rising from her calves to her thighs. She lunged for the stone key, dropped it, and heard it strike the floor beneath the current. For one terrible second, her fingers found nothing but rushing water. She flattened her palm to the bottom and swept toward the drain. The key caught against her smallest finger. Clara seized it and fitted it back into the wheel. The current pushed her sideways. Her shoulder struck stone. She braced one foot in a cedar notch and forced the wheel closed by 2 turns. The pitch lowered. Not safe. Safer. She crawled toward the exit while the water chased her. At the vertical shaft, the first rung tore loose under her weight. She fell into the channel, swallowed icy water, and lost the lamp. Darkness became absolute. She reached upward and found the next rung. Her wet boots slipped against the wall. The tunnel filled with the sound of her breathing and the immense roar moving through stone. Up, she told herself. Only up. She climbed by touch. Outside, the main surge began to weaken. The passage lay under a sheet of gray water carrying broken crates, hats, tools, and lengths of rope toward the lower desert. Thorne stood on a boulder, drenched to the waist. "This is company property," he shouted, though most of his men had already fled beyond hearing. Nishi faced him from the gate. "No," he said. "It is water. You never learned the difference." Thorne looked toward the ridge vents, then at the ruined powder. His expression was not surrender. It was humiliation stripped of its civilized covering. He pointed at Nishi. "This is not finished." Nishi's gaze shifted toward the hidden access panel. Neither was his waiting. Clara reached the final bend on her elbows. The exit panel did not move when she struck it. "Nishi." Her voice vanished beneath the water's roar. She pressed both feet against the stone behind her and shoved with her shoulder. The cedar panel lifted half an inch, jammed, then rose suddenly. Cold evening air struck her face. 2 large hands caught her beneath the arms and pulled her free. Clara landed on the ground coughing water. Nishi knelt beside her, one palm braced between her shoulder blades. The blue cloth had come loose and hung around her neck. Blood darkened the sleeve over her bruised shoulder. "The key!" she gasped. Nish looked at her closed fist. She opened it. The notched stone lay in her palm. He took it, then folded her fingers back over it. "You keep it." The last Syndicate rider disappeared into the passage below. For several minutes, neither of them moved. Rain began at last, sparse drops ticking against cedar and hot stone. The smell of wet dust rose around them. Clara sat up. "The north valve slips under full pressure. You nearly drowned." "It still slips." Nishi's expression tightened. "We will repair it after you can lift your arm." "I can lift it." She tried and stopped when pain flashed across her face. Nishi lifted one eyebrow. "Tomorrow," she said. He helped her stand without making the gesture feel like rescue. Together they walked toward the house while water drained from the passage and thunder rolled beyond the southern ridge. Behind them, the cedar gates remained upright. At the Syndicate camp, Preston Thorne fed the legal notice into the fire. The parchment curled black at the edges. Wax seals melted and ran like blood across his fingers before he let the page fall. Josiah Blackwood watched from the far side of the flames. His coat was still damp. He had seen the horses nearly break their legs in the flood. He had seen the powder wash into the desert. He had also seen Thorne order Grissom to light a fuse beside panicked animals and trapped men. "The county will hear about this," Blackwood said. Thorne placed another deed in the fire. "The county will hear that an Apache trespasser attacked lawful agents of a chartered company. That is not what happened." Thorne looked up slowly. "What happened is whatever survives in writing. The survey does not support our claim. The survey no longer matters." Blackwood glanced at the burning papers. Thorne's face had changed. The composed executive who arrived in the territory had been washed away in the passage. What remained was a man more afraid of returning defeated than of becoming criminal. "Gather everyone who is still willing to earn his pay," Thorne said. "We take the upper intake. Without water, the ranch lasts 3 days, and if they follow us, they will be busy at the gates." Grissom emerged from the darkness, mud dried across his clothes. He looked at Blackwood with contempt. "Surveyor losing his stomach?" Blackwood said nothing. Thorne handed him an oilskin packet. "You know the intake map. Block the throat before dawn." The packet held blasting caps, cord, and a sketch of the upper channel. Blackwood stared at it. "Do this," Thorne said quietly, "and I will forget every hesitation you have shown." The offer was not mercy. It was a warning. Blackwood closed his fingers around the packet. Across the dark basin, the water beneath Ironstock Ranch resumed its steady song. Clara lay awake listening to it. Just before dawn, the note stopped. The silence beneath the floor woke Clara before the light did. She lay still in the narrow bed, one hand against the wall. Every night since arriving at the ranch, the Acequias had carried a low vibration through the stone, a steady note deeper than hearing. Now there was nothing. She dressed with one arm stiff from the previous evening and crossed the courtyard barefoot, boots in her hands so she could feel the ground. The eastern branch remained alive. The fourth vent whispered normally, but beneath the main channel, where the upper intake fed the whole basin, the stone felt dead. Nishi came from the barn fastening his belt. The water stopped, Clara said. He crouched and pressed his palm to the flagstone. A flock of birds rose from the cottonwoods below. In the pre-dawn gray, the cattle had already begun gathering near the empty troughs. "The upper throat," he said. They saddled without breakfast. The trail to the intake climbed behind the northern ridge, narrow and steep above a ravine. Frost silvered the shadowed stones. Clara rode Cinder. Nishi's bay followed so close its breath warmed her back. At the top, the intake ditch should have been loud with snowmelt. Instead, it held only shallow pools among exposed rocks. Fresh scrape marks scarred the cedar grill. Someone had forced timber and stone into the mouth of the covered channel. Nishi waded into the ditch and pulled at the first log. It did not move. The blockage had been driven inward, past the bend where his shoulders could fit. Clara tied back her hair and removed her coat. Nishi caught her wrist before she entered. "You are injured. The water does not care. I care." The words were so direct that she looked at him. His hand loosened but did not release her. Clara's shoulder ached each time she drew a full breath. The tunnel would punish it. Yet below them, the whole basin depended on this channel. The cattle could be driven out. The gardens could not. The fruit trees, winter grain, and people in 3 neighboring homesteads all drew from Nishi's water agreement. "I can fit," she said. Nishi's jaw tightened. "So can no one else." He let go. They secured a hemp rope around Clara's waist. Nishi wrapped the other end twice around a cedar post and then around his forearm. "One pull means more rope," she said. 2 means hold, 3 means pull me out. He nodded. If the water releases, do not wait for 3. I will feel it. You will feel it after I do. She almost argued, then saw that he was right. He would read the rope before she understood the current. Clara lit an oil-wrapped torch and crawled into the intake. The tunnel descended sharply. Damp stone pressed against her back. The blockage began 10 feet in. River rocks packed between lengths of timber, all driven tight with iron wedges. It was deliberate work, meant not merely to stop the flow but to make removal dangerous. Water gathered behind it under mounting pressure. Clara lay on one side and used her narrow pry bar to loosen the first wedge. Her bruised shoulder trembled. Each movement released a small thread of icy water. The rope shifted at her waist. One pull from Nishi, she answered with one. The first wedge came free. She reached deeper for the next and heard breathing, not her own. Clara extinguished the torch with wet fingers. Darkness filled the tunnel. Ahead, someone wheezed, stopped, then began again. "Who is there?" she whispered. The breathing became ragged. She relit the torch and pushed through a gap between the timber and wall. Josiah Blackwood lay in the small chamber beyond the bend. A slab of limestone pinned his right leg from the knee down. His face was gray with cold. Water had risen to his ribs. When he saw her, terror widened his eyes. "No," he said, "go back." Clara looked at the blasting cord wrapped around a brace above him. The cap had misfired. One end of the blockage had collapsed onto the man who placed it. "You did this." Blackwood's teeth chattered. Grissom packed the outer side. "I set the cap. The rock came down before I cleared. Is the charge live? I pulled the wire, I think. You think? The cap is wet." Clara slid toward him. The chamber narrowed around the fallen slab. Behind the blockage, water pressed with a deep vibration she felt in her jaw. Blackwood tried to push himself upright and cried out. "Leave me," he said. "If you shift the stone, the wall will go. It will go whether I shift it or not." She examined the limestone. One edge rested against his boot, the other against a cedar brace already bowed by pressure. She could not lift it. Nishi might, but he could not pass the bend. Clara reached for the rope and gave 2 sharp pulls. "Hold." She untied it from her waist. Blackwood stared. "What are you doing?" "Changing what the rope is for." She fed it through a gap beneath the slab and around its upper edge. The water was chest-high now. Numbing her fingers, she worked the line into a hauling loop, then passed the free end back toward the tunnel. One long pull, more rope. Nishi fed it in. Clara tied the loop to the broken cedar support and wedged her pry bar beneath the limestone. Blackwood shook his head. "You cannot move that. I do not need to move it far. What happens when the pressure breaks? We move faster." She gave 3 pulls. The rope went tight. Nishi pulled from outside. The line strained. The cedar brace creaked. Clara pushed down on the pry bar with both hands. Pain tore through her shoulder. The slab shifted half an inch. Blackwood screamed. "Pull your leg," Clara shouted. "It's caught." She reached beneath the stone. His boot heel had jammed in a crack. Clara drew her knife and cut the leather down the side. The slab settled. "Again," she yelled. Though Nishi could not hear words through the stone, she jerked the rope 3 times. It tightened. Clara leaned her whole weight onto the bar. The limestone rose just enough. Blackwood tore his foot free, leaving the boot beneath it. The cedar brace split. Water punched through the new opening. Clara grabbed Blackwood's coat and pushed him toward the bend. He tried to crawl, but the crushed leg dragged behind him. The charge above them sparked. A tiny orange point burned at the wet cord. Clara slashed it with her knife. The cord fell into the water and died. Behind them, the blockage began to move. Stone ground against stone. The sound was slow and enormous. Blackwood froze. "Go!" Clara struck his shoulder. They entered the narrow section together. There was not enough room to pass side by side. Clara went first, pulling him by the front of his coat while he clawed at the walls. The first log broke loose behind them. Water filled the tunnel from floor to ceiling. Clara's torch vanished. The current threw her forward. Her forehead struck stone. She kept one fist locked in Blackwood's coat. The rope around the slab tore free and snapped past her legs. Outside, Nishi felt the line go slack. He did not wait for a signal. He wrapped the rope around both hands and pulled. Inside, the current reversed Clara's direction. For a moment, she could not tell which way led out. Then the rope dragged across her ankle. She caught it, looped it around Blackwood's wrist, and held on. Nishi hauled. They scraped through the final bend while the released intake roared behind them. Blackwood's damaged leg struck every ridge in the stone. His cries became bubbles in the water. Daylight appeared as a pale oval. Clara pushed Blackwood toward it. Nishi's hand closed around the surveyor's coat and ripped him from the opening. Clara followed on the next surge, landing face down in the ditch as water exploded around her. For several seconds she could not breathe. Nishi turned her over. She coughed until muddy water ran from her mouth and nose. Blackwood lay nearby, shivering violently, 1 foot bare and bleeding. The intake thundered behind them, free again. Nish looked from the surveyor to Clara. Understanding entered his face slowly. "You saved him." Clara rolled onto one elbow. He was in the way. Blackwood gave a broken laugh that became a cough. Nishi carried him down the mountain. He did not sling the man like cargo. He lifted him carefully, one arm beneath the knees and one behind the back, despite knowing this was the person who had poisoned grain, mapped their walls, and stopped their water. At the lower intake shack, Clara cut away Blackwood's trouser leg. The knee was badly swollen but not crushed. She set the foot with 2 cedar splints and wrapped it in clean cloth. Nishi stood near the door, silent. Blackwood watched his hands. "I was not supposed to be there when it blew," he said. Nishi did not respond. Thorne wanted the main intake buried. Grissom packed enough powder to bring down half the slope. "I reduced the charge." "You still set it," Clara said. "Yes. Why?" Blackwood looked toward the open window. Water moved through the ditch outside, bright under the morning sun. "My wife died 2 winters ago. There were doctor bills. Thorne bought the debt and gave me work. Each time I objected, the debt grew on paper. By the time I understood, every survey I had signed belonged to him." "That explains your chain," Nishi said. "Not why you used it on others." Blackwood closed his eyes. "No," he whispered. "It does not." Clara tied off the bandage. "What happens next?" Blackwood opened his eyes again. "Midnight assault. 20 men, maybe more. Marksmen on the east ridge. The ram at the main gates. Grissom comes through the false drainage stone once the noise starts." "He believes the door you showed him," Clara said to Nish. Blackwood looked between them. "It is false?" Nishi's expression gave nothing away. Blackwood swallowed. "Thorne has an order drafted from a judge in Santa Pilar. It is unsigned. He planned to fill the signature after the ranch was taken." "Where is it?" Clara asked. "In his dispatch case." "What proof exists of the poisoning?" "The purchase receipt is in the same case. Strychnine from a pharmacy in Tucson. Grissom signed for it." Nishi moved closer. "Will you tell the marshal?" Blackwood stared at the wet floorboards. "If I do, Thorne will see me hanged with him." "If you do not," Clara said, "he will bury you in the next tunnel." The surveyor looked at her. In his face she saw shame, fear, and the exhausted relief of a man who had finally reached a consequence he could not measure his way around. "I will tell him," he said. Nishi gave him paper, ink, and a board to write upon. Blackwood recorded the locations of the Syndicate camp, the powder stores, the false court order, and every order he could remember. He signed the statement twice. The red-bearded ranch hand, Amos, rode for Santa Pilar with 1 copy hidden in his boot. He took the northern trail, avoiding the passage. The second copy Clara sealed inside an empty lamp oil tin and hid in the Acequia wall. By afternoon, Blackwood could sit upright. He drew Thorne's assault plan in the dust of the intake shack. The marksmen would fire from the eastern ridge to keep defenders below the wall. The ram crew would strike the gates. Under cover of noise, Grissom and 4 men would enter the drainage chamber and climb through what they believed was an open foundation breach. Another group would circle to the lower corral and set fire to the hay. Nishi studied the map. "They divide because they believe we defend walls," he said. Clara traced the water channels beneath the courtyard. "Then we make them defend themselves from the ground." They returned to the ranch before sunset. Miller, the neighboring rancher to the south, waited outside the gates with 2 of his hands. He had heard the explosion at the intake and seen Syndicate riders on the ridge. Miller was a square man with a sunburned neck and a habit of speaking to Nishi while looking past Clara. He removed his hat. "Trouble coming?" he asked. "Yes," Clara said. He glanced at her as if surprised the answer had come from that height. "I can spare 2 rifles," he told Nishi. Nishi looked at Clara. Miller noticed. "We need riders sent to the eastern homesteads," Clara said. "Tell them not to approach the basin. Then take your men home." Miller's mouth tightened. "I did not come to run messages for a girl. No. You came to offer 2 rifles against 20 men. That will create 2 dead neighbors and leave your families undefended." One of Miller's hands looked away to hide a smile. Clara continued. "If you want to help, keep Thorne's scouts from using your south road. Fell 2 dead trees across the wash. Do not engage them." Miller stared at her. "You giving orders at this ranch now?" Nishi answered. She is. The words fell with the weight of a gate bar. Miller replaced his hat. Then I suppose I heard the order. He rode away without another argument. Clara watched him go. He dislikes me. He dislikes being wrong in front of witnesses. Is that common? Among men, yes. Among giants? Nishi picked up a capstone. Especially giants. They worked until darkness. At the false drainage entrance, Clara set the lower release so water would rise quickly to a man's knees, then more slowly to his chest. A second lever opened an escape grate to the outer ditch. The trap could frighten without killing unless the men fired into the braces and collapsed the chamber. In the inner courtyard, Nishi showed her a narrow service corridor built between two walls. It was only 10 inches wide in places, used to inspect air vents. Grissom could not enter it, but Clara could move through the full length of the compound unseen. They rigged a counterweighted slab at the far junction. If dropped, it would seal the corridor behind an intruder and form a stone cell with an iron viewing grate. At the gates, they loosened the central guide under the battering lane. The first heavy strike would hold. The second would trigger a pivot beneath the road, sending the ram sideways toward its own support wagon. No trap relied on powder. No trap required a bullet to find flesh. Nish brought Clara a leather pouch after midnight. Inside was the notched stone key, a small compass, and a folded strip of cloth. "What is this?" she asked. "A list." The cloth held marks drawn in charcoal. 3 short lines, a circle, 2 crossed strokes. Nishi explained each symbol. They represented the sluice order if sound became impossible during the assault. "This one closes the north branch," he said. "And this means leave." Clara looked at him. "You included it twice, so you understand its importance." "I understand you are hopeful." He almost smiled. They sat in the kitchen after the others took their positions. A pot of coffee had boiled too long on the stove. It tasted bitter enough to sting the tongue. Clara wrapped both hands around the tin cup. "Were you always here?" she asked. Nishi looked toward the dark window. "My mother was born near the eastern spring. My father worked cattle for a Mexican rancher before buying the lower basin. The title came through 3 offices and 2 languages. Men have tried to call it uncertain ever since. Did you build all of this? With family. Some are dead. Some were driven north. Some chose towns. The walls remember more hands than mine." Clara nodded. She had wondered why he disliked praise that made him sound like a lone giant who raised a fortress from nothing. The ranch was not a monument to one man. It was the remaining shape of many lives. "My mother could repair a wagon wheel faster than my father," Clara said. "He told customers he taught her. She let him." "Why?" "She said a roof is sometimes worth letting a foolish man own the story." Knight considered that. Was she happy? No. Then the roof cost too much. Outside, a nightbird called twice. The signal from the ridge. Thorne's men were moving. Nishi stood and set down his cup. Clara tucked the notched key into her belt. Neither said goodbye. The first rifle shot struck the east wall just before midnight. A second splintered the edge of a firing slit. The ranch hands stayed below the parapet as ordered. From the ridge, Syndicate marksmen fired at shadows, spending ammunition against stone. Then came the ram. 20 men carried a trimmed cedar trunk suspended by ropes beneath a wheeled frame. They advanced through the passage under canvas shields. Thorne rode behind them with Grissom at his side. The gates loomed dark ahead. "Last opportunity," Thorne called. "Open in the name of the territorial court." Clara listened from beneath the courtyard floor. Through a small vent she could hear his voice distorted by stone. Nishi stood behind the gates. "Show the judge's signature," he called. Thorne lifted the false order but did not approach close enough for anyone to read it. "You will see it after surrender. Then you do not have it." The ram crew shouted and ran. The cedar trunk struck the gates. The whole structure shook. Dust fell from the inner arch. A rawhide binding stretched but held. Clara placed one hand on the tension wheel. The second strike came harder. Beneath the road, the loosened guide dropped. The ram frame pivoted left. The rear swung across the passage and smashed into the wagon carrying spare powder. Men scattered, one wheel broke. The ram hung crooked from its ropes, useless until reset. Nish opened a narrow panel and threw out a hooked chain. It caught the frame. Ranch hands hauled from inside, pulling the broken machine tight against the gate where the attackers could not recover it. Thorne shouted for axes. On the western flank, Grissom slipped away with 4 men. They found the loose drainage stone exactly where Blackwood had promised. Grissom pulled it free and grinned at the dark opening. "Primitive walls," he said. "Always a crack." He entered first. Clara felt the chamber grate shift beneath her palm. She opened the upper release 1/4. Cold water flowed into the drainage room. Grissom and his men waded forward. The passage ended at a stone wall. One man turned. "There's no door. Find the latch." Water reached their boots. From an iron pipe above them came Nishi's voice, low and clear. "You found what I wanted you to find." The men spun toward the sound. Grissom fired into the pipe. The bullet ricocheted and struck stone. Clara opened the valve another 1/4. Water rose to their knees. Panic entered the chamber. 2 men ran for the entrance, but the outer plug had swung closed behind them under the current. They pounded on it. Grissom cursed Blackwood, Thorne, Nishi, and the mountain itself. "Open it!" he shouted. "You want us alive! Open it!" Clara pulled the lower escape lever. A grate lifted at floor level, revealing a crawlway toward the outer ditch. It was wide enough for the 3 smaller men. They dropped to their stomachs and fled through it. Grissom tried to follow. His shoulders jammed. He backed out, furious. The 4th man remained with him, nearly as broad. The water reached their waists. Clara closed the upper release. The level stopped rising. Grissom stared at the pipe above. "Little girl," he roared. "I know you're listening." She did not answer. The main attack continued. Axes struck the gates. Marksmen fired at every opening. Thorne ordered the wet powder moved to higher ground and fresh charges set beneath the eastern post. Clara left the drainage controls and entered the service corridor. Stone pressed against both shoulders. She moved sideways through darkness, guided by the marks Nishi had cut at knee height. At the eastern post, she peered through a slit. 3 men crouched outside with a powder bag and drill. One turned a hand auger into the cedar, while another kept the fuse dry under his coat. Clara reached overhead and pulled a waxed line. A vent opened above them, releasing a stream no thicker than a finger. It struck the fuse man's collar and ran down his back. He jumped, swore, and exposed the powder to the water. The others dragged it away. She moved to the next station. Nishi crossed the courtyard above her, carrying capstones to reinforce the gate from within. A bullet struck the wall beside him. Stone chips cut his cheek. He did not slow. At the western wall, a ranch hand named Tomas cried out. A round had passed through the firing slit and torn his upper arm. Nishi pulled him below cover, tied a bandage, and sent him to the kitchen. The attackers brought ladders. Clara heard the scrape of wood against stone and changed direction. She emerged through a hatch behind the inner parapet. One ladder rose above the wall. A man's hand gripped the top. Clara did not shoot him. She used a pry bar to lift the ladder's hook from the stone. The ladder slid sideways and fell into a hay cart below, dumping 3 climbers into straw. Another ladder caught at the north corner. Nishi seized it from inside and pushed. Men below strained to hold it. For a breath, the wood stood between opposing forces. Then Nishi twisted. The ladder split along its length. The upper half fell into the courtyard. The lower collapsed outside. Thorne watched from the passage, face pale in the muzzle flashes. His plan had assumed defenders would respond to force with force. He had expected rifles, casualties, and fear. Instead, every tool he brought became part of the ranch's machinery. Water spoiled powder, walls redirected men, gates swallowed the ram. The defenders did not fight like an army, because the ranch was not a fort built for war. It was a working system, and every useful part could become a defense in hands that understood it. "Burn the hay!" Thorne shouted. The South team did not answer. Miller had felled trees across the wash and driven their horses loose without firing a shot. Thorne sent 2 riders to find them. One returned alone. "Roads blocked. Miller's men are on the ridge." "Miller?" "He says the South Road is private property." Thorne's face twisted. The alliance he had counted on through prejudice and fear was closing against him. "Bring Grissom," he said. No one moved. "Where is Grissom?" From beneath the western wall came a distant pounding. Clara heard it through the corridor. She opened the drainage chamber's speaking pipe. "Silas," she said. The pounding stopped. His face appeared behind the iron viewing grate, wet hair plastered to his forehead. The water had lowered to his thighs, but cold had turned his lips pale. "Get me out. You came through the opening willingly. You trapped us. You were entering a home at midnight with a rifle." Grissom gripped the bars. "You think this makes you big?" Clara leaned closer. "No." His confusion showed. "I stopped needing that." The 4th man sat against the far wall, shivering. Clara opened a second crawl grate large enough for him. He hesitated. "Leave your rifle," she said. The man dropped it and crawled out. Grissom tried to force himself after him, but again the passage stopped at his shoulders. Clara looked at the man who had called her a doll, a rat, and a mistake. He had measured every person by mass because mass was the only advantage he trusted. Now the architecture made that advantage useless. "The frontier is not built for men like you," she said. Grissom's eyes burned. "Men like me built it. Men like you broke things and named the wreckage progress. Builders came afterward." She closed the speaking pipe. Above them, Thorne ordered the final charge placed. The powder crew crawled beneath the eastern edge of the ram frame and packed 2 dry bags against the gatepostes. A fuse ran back to the shelter of a boulder. Nishi saw it through the lower slit. "Clara," he called. She heard only a muffled vibration. He struck the floor 3 times with the butt of his wrench. Circle, line, cross strokes. The signal they had agreed meant eastern post, full pressure. Clara reached the main sluice wheel. A crack opened along the old north valve as she turned it. Cold mist filled the crawl space. The mechanism still slipped. She fitted the notched key and braced her back against the wall. Outside, Thorne knelt behind the boulder with the fuse cord. He struck a match. Nishi opened the gate panel and stepped into the passage. Thorne stared. "You finally surrender?" Nishi walked toward the powder bags. Rifles rose around him. "Stop!" Thorne shouted. Nishi did not. Thorne touched the flame to the fuse. It caught with a bright hiss. Clara opened the sluice. The eastern vent released under the powder crew. Water exploded upward, throwing 1 man onto the ram frame and rolling the powder bags into the center of the road. The fuse continued burning across the wet ground, protected by its oil coating. Nishi ran. For a man his size, he moved with startling speed. He seized the broken supply wagon by its sideboard and heaved. The vehicle tilted, groaned, and fell across the powder bags. The fuse vanished beneath it. "Down!" Someone screamed. The explosion lifted the wagon from the ground. Fire and splintered wood filled the passage. The blast struck Nishi and threw him against the gate. Stone dust swallowed everything. Clara felt the shock through the sluice wheel. The mechanism jumped from her hands. For 1 second, she heard nothing. Then the north valve broke open. Water slammed into the chamber. She was driven against the wall, the notched key torn from her fingers. The current rose to her waist, then chest. The exit lay 20 feet behind 2 narrow bends. Above, through the roar, she heard the gate timber crack. Nishi was down. Clara found the wheel shaft beneath the water. The key was gone. She could not close the valve by hand. Her fingers touched the leather pouch at her belt. The small compass inside had a brass hinge pin. She tore it free, drove the pin into the key slot, and twisted. The brass bent. The wheel moved a fraction. She used the pry bar through the spokes and forced it another turn. Her injured shoulder screamed. The pressure lowered enough for her to breathe. Clara crawled toward the surface. The hatch above the crawl space had warped from the explosion. She struck it with her shoulder once, twice, then used the pry bar against the frame. Cedar cracked. Smoke entered before light did. Clara pulled herself into the courtyard. The eastern gate leaned inward. 1 hinge had split. The passage beyond was a gray wall of dust broken by small fires in the wreckage. Nishi lay near the threshold. She ran to him. Blood darkened the side of his shirt. A long splinter had passed beneath the skin along his ribs, but his chest moved. Clara knelt and pressed both hands against the wound. His eyes opened. "The valve?" he asked. "Still open. Close it." "You are bleeding." "The basin first. I am not leaving you here." Nishi gripped her wrist. Even weakened, his hand closed like iron. "The ranch hands can carry me. Only you can reach the wheel." Tomas and Amos emerged through the smoke. Together, they dragged Nishi behind the inner wall. Clara turned back toward the hatch. A figure came through the damaged gate. Preston Thorne's coat was torn. One side of his face bled from flying stone. He held a silver revolver in both hands. The explosion had scattered his men. Some were running toward the passage. Others crouched behind wreckage. Thorne no longer looked like a representative of anything. He looked like a cornered man whose entire life depended on forcing the world to agree that he had not lost. He aimed at Clara. "You," he said. She stood beside the open hatch, empty-handed except for the pry bar. "You turned them against me," Clara said. "You brought them here. I had contracts. You burned them." His eyes flickered. He knew Blackwood had spoken. "Where is he?" "Alive." "That was your mistake." Thorne cocked the revolver. Nishi tried to rise behind the wall. Amos held him down. Clara heard water building beneath the courtyard. The broken valve was feeding too much pressure into the eastern branch. If she did not close it soon, the lower wall would fail and flood the ranch itself. Thorne stepped closer. "You could have had a place," he said. "I offered you work." You offered me obedience at half value. I offered survival. No. You offered the kind of life where I had to thank you for making me smaller. His finger tightened. A brass telescope struck his wrist. The shot went into the air. Josiah Blackwood stood in the gate opening on one leg, using the wall for support. He had ridden from the intake shack on a mule, his splinted foot hanging clear of the stirrup. The telescope he had thrown rolled across the stones. Thorne turned the revolver toward him. Blackwood raised both empty hands. The marshal has my statement. You signed nothing. I signed twice. Thorne's face went blank. From the passage came hoofbeats, not scattered riders, a measured column. The town marshal entered the basin with 6 deputies. Amos's northern ride had been faster than anyone expected, and Miller had met the law on the south road with confirmation of the assault. "Drop it, Thorne," the marshal called. For a moment Thorne looked at the damaged gate. The wounded rancher, the small woman in mud-streaked clothes, and the surveyor he had believed too frightened to betray him. He seemed to search for the version of the world in which all of them still occupied places beneath him. He did not find it. The revolver fell from his hand. Deputies moved through the passage, disarming the remaining Syndicate men. 2 opened the drainage chamber and brought out Grissom in chains. He emerged soaked, shaking, and silent. When he saw Clara, he looked away first. The marshal collected Blackwood's statement, the false court order from Thorne's dispatch case, the pharmacy receipt, and the surviving blasting supplies. He listened while Blackwood described the sabotage of the intake and the planned seizure. Thorne tried once to speak of company jurisdiction. The marshal held up the unsigned order. "This bears the name of a judge who has been dead 6 months. Thorne said nothing more. Clara did not watch the arrests finish. The floor beneath her had begun to tremble. She retrieved the brass telescope, placed it in Blackwood's hands, and pointed toward the main house. "Keep pressure on Shisei's wound." "What are you doing?" "Saving the water again." She dropped into the hatch. The crawl space was nearly full. She entered on her back, nose barely above the current, and pulled herself along the ceiling braces. At the broken valve, the wheel spun slowly under pressure. The notched stone key had lodged beneath a cedar lip. Clara reached for it. Her fingertips brushed the edge, but the current pushed it farther. She removed the blue cloth from her hair and looped it through the wheel spoke. With the cloth around her wrist, she anchored herself against the wall and stretched again. This time she caught the key. It fit the slot with a solid click. Clara turned the wheel 1 notch at a time. The water fought every movement. Her shoulder had gone beyond pain into numbness. She used her legs, her back, the wall, and the cloth binding her to the spoke. The wheel closed. The roar fell to a hiss, then to the deep, steady note she knew. Clara rested her forehead against the iron. For a few seconds she allowed herself to shake. When she climbed out, morning had begun whitening the eastern ridge. The law wagons stood outside the gates. Thorne sat in one with his wrists shackled. Grissom occupied the other side, wrapped in a blanket. Blackwood had chosen to ride with them to Santa Pilar and give formal testimony. Before leaving, he offered Clara the brass telescope again. "I used it to search for weaknesses," he said. "You may find a better purpose." She accepted it. "Your debt does not disappear because you testified." "I know, but it becomes yours to pay instead of Thorne's to own." Blackwood lowered his head. "That is more than I expected." The wagons rolled out through the narrow mountain passage. Clara watched until the dust settled. Then she went inside to Nishi. He sat at the kitchen table while Tomas stitched the wound beneath his ribs. A bottle of whiskey stood open beside the basin of bloody water. Nishi had refused to drink enough of it to dull his mind. Clara placed the notched key on the table. "I said you should keep it," he told her. "I nearly lost it twice and found it twice." Tomas tied off the final stitch and left them alone. Nishi looked at Clara's swollen shoulder and the cut above her eyebrow. "Sit." She sat. He cleaned the cut with a cloth dipped in whiskey. It burned. Clara flinched. "You walked into a powder blast," she said. "You crawled into a flooded valve. That was necessary, so was mine." They considered each other across the table. "Both foolish," Clara said. "Both necessary. That is not the same." "No." Outside, the ranch hands began clearing wreckage from the gates. The ordinary sounds of work returned. Shovels in mud, axes against broken timber, horses snorting in the cool air. Nishi pushed the key toward her once more. "This ranch needs someone who hears what others miss." Clara closed her hand around it. "And someone who steps in front of wagons. That skill is less rare." She laughed softly, then winced at her shoulder. By noon, Miller arrived with 4 men and a wagon loaded with seasoned cedar. He stopped outside the damaged entrance. The gates were scorched, one post tilted, and half the passage remained under drying mud. Clara stood on a low stone directing the removal of the ruined ram frame. Miller dismounted and took off his hat. "I saw the flare," he said. "Heard the blast. Brought wood." Clara looked at the wagon. The beams were straight-grained and already cured. "We need the longest 2 for the lower hinges," she said. "The rest can brace the eastern wall." Miller nodded. He did not look toward Nishi for approval. "My men, 2 clear silt from the main run. 1 helps Amos heat the warped iron. You work with me on the post." Miller put his hat back on. "Yes, ma'am." There was no apology in the words, but there was something more useful. Obedience without condescension. They repaired the gate over 4 days. Nishi was forbidden from lifting foundation stones until his stitches closed, an instruction he ignored until Clara placed every heavy tool in a locked storeroom and kept the key in her pocket. He responded by sitting near the work and pointing out errors with infuriating accuracy. "The brace is high," he said on the first afternoon. "It is level, with the wall, not with the load." Clara checked and found him right by a 1/4 inch. She reset it without comment. On the second day, he said, "Miller's knot will slip." Miller muttered something under his breath and tied it again. On the 3rd day, Clara found Nish carrying a capstone one-handed. She stood in his... "Put it down. It is small. It weighs more than I do. Many things do. Put it down." Miller's men became intensely interested in their shovels. Nishi lowered the stone. By sunset on the 4th day, the cedar gate stood square again. The new wood was golden against the weathered gray of the old beams. Fire scars remained along the western leaf, and Clara chose not to plane them away. "Why leave the black marks?" Miller asked. "So the next man with papers remembers the cost of bad reading," she said. He accepted that. The Acequias required longer repair. Blast vibration had shifted 3 interior joints. Clara spent hours beneath the ridge resetting cedar wedges, clearing silt, and listening for changes in tone. In a chamber near the secondary sluice, her lamp revealed a green shoot growing from damp sediment between 2 stones. It had no business surviving there. No direct sun reached the chamber. The seed had probably washed down from the upper meadow during the flood and lodged in a thin pocket of soil. Clara knelt beside it. She could have moved it to daylight. Instead, she placed small river pebbles around the roots to keep the current from washing them away. Then she angled a polished piece of metal near the vent so a narrow reflection of morning light would reach the leaves. The work took nearly an hour. When she told Nishi, he asked, "What kind of plant?" "I do not know." "Then why save it?" "It was growing." He nodded as though that answered everything. Weeks passed. News arrived from Santa Pilar by mail rider. Preston Thorne was charged with fraud, attempted seizure under false authority, destruction of property, and conspiracy to poison livestock. Grissom faced additional charges for assault and use of explosives. Blackwood pleaded guilty to sabotage but received a reduced sentence after his testimony and the evidence he provided. The Western Range and Water Company denied knowledge of Thorne's methods. Its board dismissed him before trial and withdrew the basin claim. A new survey, conducted under the marshal's supervision, confirmed that the upper spring and covered channels lay entirely within Nishi's title. The paper did not restore the broken cedar or remove the scars from Clara's shoulder. It did something smaller and still important. It closed the door through which another man might attempt the same lie. One cold morning, Nishi asked Clara to meet him in the office. The room was barely more than a table, a chair, and shelves of account books. Dust moved in the sunlight from a narrow window. On the desk lay a sheet of heavy parchment. Clara read it twice. It transferred a half interest in the ranch operations and the waterworks to Clara Vance, with equal authority over maintenance, contracts, and use agreements. The land title itself remained in trust with Nishi's family line, but the working estate and its income would belong to them jointly. She looked up. "No." Nishi stood across from her. "Read the last page." "I read it." "Then you know it is not a gift. It is half a ranch. It is half the work. I already do half the work." "Yes. Then why paper it?" "Because Thorne was right about one thing. What survives in writing matters when strangers arrive." Clara looked at the signature line. Her father had died without naming her in the wagon shop accounts. Her brothers claimed the absence proved she had contributed nothing. For years she had distrusted documents because men used them to erase what hands had built. Nishi placed the ink bottle beside her. "Paper can lie," he said. It can also remember. Clara picked up the pen. Her signature was small and exact. Nishi did not sign with the pen. He pressed his thumb into the ink and set the print beside her name, dark ridges crossing the parchment like a topographic map. The two marks sat side by side, one narrow, one broad, neither above the other. Clara waited for him to say something ceremonial. He rolled the paper, tied it with plain cord, and said, "The fourth vent needs checking." She smiled. Now, it has needed checking since yesterday. They went to work. By the first frost, the basin had recovered. Winter grain stood green along the lower terrace. Cattle returned to the northern pasture. The cottonwoods shed yellow leaves into the clear ditches. Water moved through the repaired channels with an even, resonant hum. Travelers began using a new name for the entrance. Miller said it first at the trading post. A freighter asked whether the Syndicate damage had closed the narrow mountain passage. Miller answered, "Clara's gate is open." The name spread because frontier names often did, through repetition, usefulness, and the pleasure people took in telling a story without admitting they had once been wrong. Clara heard it from a mail rider weeks later. She pretended not to care. That evening she carried a chisel to the left gate. The cedar was cool beneath her palm. At her eye level below the iron band, she carved a small symbol made of intersecting lines and circles. It was not her name. It was a simplified map of the Acequias branches. Mountain water entering one line, dividing through stone, returning to a common basin. Nishi watched from the ridge while she worked. When the carving was finished, Clara brushed the cedar dust away. "You marked the gate," he said. "I marked the water. People will say it is your sign. People say many things." He touched the carved lines with one finger. "This branch is wrong." Clara looked sharply at him. Nishi's mouth curved. She shoved his hand away from the gate. The sound of his laugh followed them across the courtyard. Years later, people told the story badly. They made Nishi taller each time, until he could lift a wagon with one hand. They made Clara smaller, until she could disappear inside a saddlebag. They filled the siege with 100 gunmen, bolts of lightning, and a flood high enough to carry cattle over the ridge. The truth was less polished and more difficult. A ranch survived because its defenders knew how it worked. A man strong enough to move foundation stones understood that strength had limits. A woman dismissed for the space she occupied became essential because she had spent her life learning the value of exact spaces. Neither saved the basin alone. Nishi's knowledge gave Clara a path through the mountain. Clara's hands gave that knowledge reach. Blackwood's confession mattered because she saved a guilty man when leaving him would have been easier. Miller's help mattered because respect became useful only when it changed his actions. The scars remained. In cold weather, Clara's right shoulder ached. Nishi's ribs pulled when he lifted too quickly. The western gate carried a black burn where the powder wagon exploded. Deep inside the Acequias, a strip of faded blue ribbon stayed sealed behind a basalt repair, invisible but still holding the first emergency brace. The green shoot in the lower chamber grew into a pale vine. It never became large. Each spring it produced 3 small white flowers where reflected light touched the wall. Clara refused to move it. On the 5th anniversary of the siege, she stood at the basin rim before sunrise. Mist lay over the cottonwoods. Below, the water channels shone silver through the fields. Nishi approached carrying a wrench and 2 cups of coffee. He handed her one. "The 4th vent?" she asked. "Holding steady. The western post? Dry. The lower channel? Your vine has another flower." Clara drank. The coffee was still too bitter. Nishi had never learned to remove the pot from the stove in time. Far beyond the gates, the desert stretched toward Santa Pilar and the railway towns. Companies had grown larger. New fences crossed old trails. Men still arrived with papers and spoke of inevitability. Inside the basin, the measure of things remained different. A wall was judged by the stones no one noticed. A water system lived through channels no visitor could see. A partnership held because each person understood where the other was strong and where they were not. Nishi looked down at Clara. "They called you too small for this land." She watched sunlight reach the top of the cedar gates. They were measuring the wrong thing. The water hummed beneath their boots. Together they walked back toward the ranch house, their shadows stretching across the red earth, one broad, one narrow, joined at the edge by the rising sun.